Welcome back. In the previous set of videos, we learned about variables and constants. In each of those cases, we assigned some text to the variable or constant. We kept referring to the text as strings. Why? When we type out some text, the computer actually treats each letter separately. We call text a string because you can think of a word as a bunch of characters held together on a string, much like a banner at a party. Earlier, we mentioned types as a construct to represent different kinds of data. In Swift, strings are represented by the string type. To create a string, or more formally a string literal, we enclose some text within a pair of double quotes. Remember syntax, the set of rules we need to follow? Well, this is the syntax for creating a string literal. Back in our playground, let's create a new page to talk about types. At the top right-hand corner, you should see two sets of 3 buttons. The first button in the second set over here opens up a navigator and lets us organize our files neatly. So click on this button right here to open up the navigator on your end. Our Swift Basics playground consists of a single page right now. This page is named Untitled. You can't see that it's named that because when we have just a single page, the navigator doesn't show it by default. So let's add a new page. Now at the bottom of the navigator, in the left-hand side, there's an Add button. Click on it and select New Page. Now you should see the 2 pages. The original page is named Untitled. We'll rename that. But for now, let's name this new page Types. Okay, and just to organize this better, click on Untitled Page, hit Enter, and we'll call this Variables and Constants. Okay, so back to the Types page. Now, when you download project code for this video or for any point in this course, for example, you may be looking for a particular page where you left off in the video, but it might be loaded onto another page. So for example, if you're downloading the code for the types video and you open up the download and it's on variables and constants, remember that you simply need to either click on the project navigator and get to the file or the page that you need, or up at the top here, there's like a table of contents and you can go to Swift Basics and then select the right page. Okay, back to types. Let's get rid of all the code in here and start fresh. Okay, let's create our first string literal. There's more than one way to create a string, and when we simply write some text between 2 double quotes, we call this a string literal. We already did this before when working with variables, so you should be a little familiar with it. Remember, we're always going to use constants, so we start with let and a constant name, so we'll call this country. And to this, we're going to assign a string literal. Let's write down the names of the country we currently live in. So I live in the United States of America. After the name of the constant, we use the equal to sign, the assignment operator, to assign anything to a variable or constant. And here we're assigning a string literal. Remember, to create a string literal, we start with an opening double quote, we put some text in there, and then a closing double quote. This seems simple, but it's so easy to forget a quote or to do something silly like that and have your program stop working. Luckily, the compiler helps us quite a bit. A lot of people get frustrated when they see an error when they're writing code, but my view on the matter is pretty simple. Better the error that the compiler can show you and you can fix, rather than one that lurks there that causes your app to crash and frustrates your customers. Okay, let's see what happens if we use the wrong syntax. If we get rid of the last double quote, the compiler knows we're trying to create a string. And if you click on the error, it informs us that our string literal is unterminated. In plain English, we forgot to close it off. If we remove either the first one or both of them altogether, it's like the error we encountered earlier. The compiler now thinks that these are separate statements, and it's asking us to put them on a different line or use a semicolon if we want to include them on the same line. Okay, so I'm going to undo that so that we have a correct string literal with the correct syntax. I'm going to create 2 more strings. The first will contain the name of the state that I live in. We'll say let state equal North Carolina. You can list your province, region, or whatever the format is in your country. And for the last string, let's write out the name of the city that we're in. So we'll say let city equal Charlotte. Now notice that for each of these string literals, we're creating a new constant entirely and assigning some value to it. When we write programs, it's common to manipulate strings in different ways. If we were writing an app that stored a customer's address for any reason, we would like to combine these three strings we have to create a mailing address. There are two ways we can create new strings using existing strings. And the first method is called concatenation. This is an overly complicated sounding word, but it's just programmer speak for adding two strings together. Concatenating two strings is really simple, and we use the addition operator and a bunch of different strings. We've all seen the addition operator before in math, but in programming, you can use it on strings too, not just numbers. So let's create a new constant. We'll start with the keyword let, and we'll call this address. And to this, we're going to assign a value that is the three strings concatenated together. So first, we start with the country, and since we've already typed this out, we can simply refer to it using the constant, so we'll say country. Then we're going to use the addition operator, and then we'll specify the state, so we want to add these two together. And then to add the city to that, we simply use another plus sign and list the city. I do want to point out one thing. As we type out a variable, for example, if I start typing city, you'll notice that Xcode is pretty helpful and suggests things for us so we can simply hit enter. This is an autocomplete feature that is common in most IDEs. And as we write more code, it becomes immensely helpful. You don't have to remember exact names since Xcode will help you out. All right, let's take a look at our results area. You see that the contents of the address constant is visible over here, and we've taken these three strings and added them together to create one large string. But by adding these strings, we've smushed them all together. This is hard to read and looks kind of silly. I'd like to put a space in the middle of each of these. And the only way to do that with string concatenation is to modify the string itself. So if we go back to all three constants over here, and in the string literal, let's add a space at the end. Now when we concatenate, it includes that space and it looks much better. But I don't like this. I want the string to be just the text that we've typed out without any additional white space characters. If we're grabbing this from a form that the user enters, there's no guarantee that they're going to include some white space at the end. What if I wanted the space in one instance, but somewhere else in the app I don't want that same space? So we can do better. Let's get rid of these spaces. Remember how I said variables and constants are what's in them? The country constant here is exactly the same as typing out the string literal over here. To concatenate strings, we don't have to assign them to a constant or variable first and then add them together, because these are simply just strings here. So you can, for example, add or concatenate two string literals directly. Now, knowing this, we can add a string in here with just some white space in between the country, state, and city. So we'll say country plus some empty space, and then state plus some empty space. And now we get the same effect as earlier. And even better, we can put commas in here if we wanted to. This solves the problem, but it's not elegant. Not to worry, there's another way that we can do this. The second way we manipulate strings in Swift is using string interpolation. You might be thinking in your head, wow, programmers love to use complicated words, don't they? And you'd be right about that. String interpolation is a way to construct a new string value from a mix of other strings. The syntax is a bit more complicated, so follow along closely. Now, before we do that, I want to point out one thing. You'll notice here, let me get rid of the comma. Now, to you, this might seem pointless. This is just a string with nothing in it. But computers consider white space, which is an empty space here, an actual thing, right? We need to be able to represent space in a computer as well. Now, this isn't an empty string, but this is. This is actually a string literal with nothing in it. But it still counts as a string, so just keep that in mind. This is an empty string, this is a string with white space. Okay, so we're going to construct this same string again, the address with a comma and a space in between, but this time we're going to use string interpolation. Okay, so first let's add a new section comment. We'll call this string interpolation. And just so you're familiar, we'll call this string concatenation. Okay, let's create a new constant to store this new address, and we'll call this interpolated address. When using string interpolation, we create a new string using the same syntax as creating a boring old string literal. So first we start off with a pair of double quotes to create an empty string, as you see here. Inside this string, we're going to add a backslash first, and then a set of empty parentheses. Okay, inside these parentheses, we're going to write out the name of our first constant, country. Look at the results area now. The string simply says the name of the country I'm in. What's going on here? When you put a backslash followed by a set of empty parentheses inside a string literal, Swift takes whatever variable or constant that is inside the parentheses and replaces it with its actual value. The backslash and the parentheses are special characters to let the compiler know that what you see here, go ahead and replace it with the value that this constant or variable represents. As you can see in the results area, the backslash and parentheses disappear, and all we see is the value of country. Using those special characters, we can add as many values as we want to create a complex string. So now, after the closing parentheses, over here this is all still inside the string literal. So now we can type out a comma, add some white space, and then using string interpolation, so a backslash, an opening parentheses, and then some other value, let's say state, we can now include the value for state. And then finally, we can put another comma in there and then repeat that for city. Now, concatenated address and interpolated address have the same contents, but we use two different methods to achieve this. Much like our question with variables and constants, I'm sure you're wondering, what's the point? How do these things differ? Well, string interpolation is a lot more powerful than concatenation. Okay, let's add another string to our list up at the top. So we'll say let street equal West Street. Now, using this street, what if I wanted to put together a street address using concatenation? In many countries, a street address is the street name with a number identifying the house or building. So let's say we now have let building number, and here we'll say 222. If we tried to build a street address using string concatenation, so we'll say let street address equal building number plus street, we'll immediately get a compiler error. And this is because you can only concatenate two strings. You cannot add a string to a number. That just doesn't make any sense, right? What is street plus 222? However, let's get rid of this, and I'm going to leave it in here, but I'm just going to comment this out so you can see it. I'll say does not compile. All right, now we can actually do this though using string interpolation. So we'll say let interpolated street address equal, and just like before, we start with double quotes to create a normal string literal, and then using the backslash and parentheses, we can pass in the building number and the street name. In the results area, you can see that this creates a perfect string literal. Now, how it's able to do this? Well, that's a bit advanced for now, so we won't get to it. But just remember that string interpolation is much more powerful than concatenation.
Using string interpolation, you can evaluate the contents of more than just strings. What's more than strings? We'll find out soon as we explore different types. But first, a quick code challenge.